The next speaker will be Dr. Gleb Albert from University of Zurich, where he works as a postdoctoral researcher, and he will now present his project on collecting and preserving the material heritage of the demo scene.
All right. Is the sound okay? Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Marco, for the introduction, and thanks for everyone who was involved in organizing this great workshop. I'm really looking forward to discussing with you about this small project of mine, and I'm particularly happy to have an audience to which I do not have to explain what the demo scene is actually about, which is, I mean, Finland is quite unique in that regard, I think. But still, I would like to say a few things, even.
Can you maybe take off the
thing?
It seems to be rubbing into.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Because the whole panel is titled like, I don't see the title anymore, but like demo scene preservation. And of course, the scene is not just about demos, and the scene does not just consist of the demo scene. So basically, the demo scene is just like one, perhaps the most prominent, but just one of the branches of what insiders of this subculture simply call the scene, which includes, well, doing releases in a particular kind of way, be it legal or illegal content, be it like pirated software or tracked music or text mode art packs or in fact demos. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, that the demo scene is not just about demos. So yeah, I would like to talk a bit about this one particular preservation project I'm doing called Got Papers, but I would also like to share with you some thoughts and some considerations about sources and about particular kinds of sources we have to deal with when we deal with early home computing history. Historians' work always circles around sources, mostly written sources. While reconstructing and interpreting the past, we're not completely free in our judgment. Sources have, as German historian Reinhard Koselleck put it, the right of veto. So it means that while historians must exercise a thorough critique of the sources, they cannot put forward interpretations that completely contradict the sources that are available to us. So as historians, we cannot argue against the sources. And of course, with digital history and with the whole realm of the digital coming into focus of historians, so like becoming particularly the early digital era becoming an era that is considered a valid subject for historians, of course the situation with sources changes a lot. So how do we write the history of digital cultures and with what kind of materials? Of course, the most commonly talked about problem is the problem of authenticity of. Sorry, this thing is. Oh yeah, I would prefer that very much.
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you explain that?
Sorry. Marco, did you just have a microphone?
I didn't set it up. With a degree in technology. Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem. All right. Yeah. Now this works much better. So yeah, what historians who now start to ask questions how to work with sources of the digital era most often talk about is the question of authenticity of digital and particularly born digital sources. So like how hard it is to establish origins of a particular digital source, how to deal with cases of deliberate manipulation and so on. And while this is of course a very urgent topic when speaking about historical sources of the digital era, this is not the topic I'm going to talk about today. Because one very particular problem with available digital sources concerns the history of home computer cultures before the rise of the World Wide Web. The sources produced by home computer user cultures can be put into two categories. On the one hand, those that were aimed at the particular user culture's internal public sphere, so like flyers, magazines, in the case of the demo scene, of course, the demos and the intros and so on. And the other group of sources would be the sources that constitute internal communication. So how did the members of these particular user cultures and subcultures communicate with each other, but like internally? The majority of historical research on the scene, on the demo scene and on similar digital cultures based their analysis on these on the sources from the, so to say, from the first group, like sources of public communication, sources of the particular subculture's public sphere. For various research questions, this is of course a valid and a very fertile source base. Through these sources, one can follow the debates within the scene, the shifts in trends and moral judgments, for example, the shifting attitudes within the demo scene towards gamers or towards the question of piracy. And also, of course, the way the scene and its members portrayed themselves and their scene to outsiders, such as like computer media and beyond. However, in order to write the history of the internal structures and practices of the scene, we also need a different kind of sources. To put it in a nutshell, we need not just the crack intro, but also the materials that document the process of how that particular crack intro and how that particular crack of a game came into being. And here we're actually leaving the domain of the digital. The particularity of this period of computer history is that the home computer was not as much a means of communication, but the reason for communication. Before the internet opened up to mass commercial use, and even more importantly, before computers became powerful enough for graphical user interfaces and multitasking, maintaining a computer-centered hobby meant communicating not as much with the computer, not as much using the computer as a communication tool, but rather for the computer. Hobbyists had to employ all sorts of like old media, such as magazines, post, telephone, in order to feed the computer with data and to obtain vital technical information. And while we do not have the possibilities to listen in on 30-year-old phone calls, the sources for these like other types of old media that were involved in this communication process are available. One just has to look for them. And just to show you a few examples of what I mean by old media used by early digital subcultures, of course, like perhaps the most well-known and the most obvious example are computer magazines with their program listings that users had to type up, classified ads which were really important for various home computer user cultures. I mean, this is, for example, a German magazine, Computer Flea Market, which solely consisted of classified ads for computer users, like not just to sell and to buy stuff, but also to communicate with each other through these adverts. And this was not only a phenomenon of Western Europe. For example, in Yugoslavia, you had several computer magazines already in the second half of the 80s, such as Moj Mikro, which for about a third of its content consists of classified ads, where mostly like small-scale software pirates were selling software. And of course, we also must not forget that the storage media of the early home computing era were physical things. Like, of course, the data saved on them was digital, but these discs and tapes themselves were physical things to be shared, to be swapped, to be decorated, to be scribbled upon, and so on. Of course, things like lists of programs people exchanged with each other. Yeah, like this is, for example, a list of public domain software that one Amiga user has and is offering as exchange goods to another Amiga user. And of course, I mean, as we are in the Museum of Games, early gaming involved also, of course, lots and lots of old media and of analog artifacts, like this book of pokes found in the Pelimuseo in Berlin. This, of course, also concerns the games industry as like on the other end of the spectrum, where well, much of the game developing process actually, at least at an early stage, began on sheets of paper. And also, just as scene internal communication and information exchange was conducted through the post, so was much of the scene social life conducted through analog media, such as paper. Floppy disks were packaged into custom-made, skillfully designed envelopes. Copy parties were advertised on paper leaflets. And before the first disc magazines, sceners produced paper zines, and so on. Just to show you a few examples. I mean, like disc covers, like I think there was an exhibition actually at this museum last year with showcasing disc covers designed by C64 sceners. Yeah, and of course, such letters were exchanged. This was the main channel of internal communication for the scene before BBSs got popular in Europe in the very last years of the 1980s. Yeah, and here actually you can see not only the old media of like written letters, but also the old medium of a typewriter, which is used here in an exchange between two computer freaks. Yeah, and actually to be a swapper, that means to be someone who exchanged, whose business in the scene was to spread the releases of the cracker groups and the demo groups. It involved a whole assemblage of material objects that were needed in order to do this sort of scene job. Yeah, and of course, like the creation of brands, which was a very which was an important part of scene groups, was also executed not just through the crack intros, but also through such stickers on paper or on vinyl. And to conclude this bit, even the process of cracking a game was also a process which involved old media, such as this kind of, these are some sort of work notes by a German C64 cracker for cracking a particular game. And I realized how important these sources were only after having started my current postdoc research project, which deals with the social and cultural history of youth and software piracy in the 80s and early 90s, or in other words, the cracker scene and its social and cultural embeddedness. Pretty soon I had to come to the conclusion that I cannot do this kind of research only using the contemporary public sources, such as intros and disc magazines, and that even oral history interviews are not covering this particular gap of perception. So I needed internal contemporary sources. As a historian who started at university by working on the history of the 1920s, I'm kind of used to working with paper sources and going to archives to collect my data. Now I had to find out pretty quickly that there was literally no archive to go to, neither computer history archives, nor youth culture archives, and nor even digital subculture archives such as the Chaos Computer Club archive in Berlin bothered to ever systematically collect the personal papers of members of the scene. This is very slowly beginning to change in the past few years. For example, one legendary C64 scener recently donated his papers to the Municipal Archive of Alkmaar in the Netherlands. And the Center for Computing History in Cambridge recently has acquired the papers of a well-known UK Amiga scener. But back in 2014, there was, as far as I could see, absolutely nothing in that regard. So I had no other choice than basically assembling the source base for my research project myself. And I knew that there was a vast amount of, so to say, public paper sources such as disc covers and paper magazines of the scene, which could be amassed. And in fact, some scene-driven preservation projects such as mags.c64.org have already done a lot of work in that direction. However, I only had very slim hope to get to the holiest of the holy, to the Holy Grail, to sceners' paper letters. And to my big relief, the more 1980s scene veterans I got to know through my project, the more it turned out that there were massive amounts of sceners' letters preserved in individuals' basements, attics, and storage rooms. And most of these individuals were actually more than willing to share these materials. So all of a sudden I was able to discover a whole new layer of scene history, one that was hardly visible on the level of public sources such as scroll texts or disc magazines. So what are these new insights that can be pulled from these sources for the history of the scene? Let me just pick three short examples. Firstly, some of these letters turned out to be key sources for the history of the interconnections between the cracker scene and the early games industry. I mean, it's well known, particularly in Finland, that a substantial portion of the skilled members of the European scene were keen to produce games on their own, and that several individuals or even whole groups managed to do so. That they either coded games and sold them to publishers, or were hired as programmers or graphic designers or musicians at bigger companies, or even founded companies themselves. And there are some very famous examples in Sweden for that. What is less known, however, is how many sceners kept on leading sort of like double existences as both crackers and game developers. And this is not something that was talked about in disc magazines or in scrollers of crack intros, because it was simply too dangerous to talk about it, especially crackers who were employed by big companies and remained active in the scene at the same time were of course at high risk of being exposed as moles, and several instances of such, it happened in several cases. The paper letters, however, which were like exchanges among sceners who trusted each other, are very open on that subject. So from these letters we can learn of sceners providing originals of their companies to cracker groups before store date, sceners working as game magazine reviewers and leaking review copies to groups, top crackers developing copy protection mechanisms for their friends, software companies, and so on. Another example, the seemingly marginal example, but a very interesting one, would be the topic of so-called greetings. Research on crack intros conducted by Marco together with Patrick Wajciak and Daniel Botz has shown the symbolic economy of sending greetings to other sceners and groups in crack intro scrollers, from which you can deduct contacts, different levels of hierarchy, and so on. And this symbolic economy becomes even more tangible in the internal communication of the early scene. It's astonishing how many letters deal with the topic of greetings. Calls like "please greet us" and assurances that "we will greet you if you keep on sending" are constitute a substantial portion of the topics such letters addressed. Moreover, one can observe whole dramas over people not being greeted or being greeted together with groups who are perceived as enemies of the complainant, or being greeted at the end and not at the beginning of the scroll text. All this is dealt with in letters extensively and explicitly, and highlights the character of the scene as an economy of status and recognition. And here is a longer example of such a drama over greeting lists and so on. Thirdly and finally, these sources hint at a different, not so symbolic economy, namely the various monetary practices within the early scene. This was a taboo topic in the scene's public communication. Like, this is not something that was talked about in discmags or scroll texts. And if it was, then it was talked about like as a sort of accusation, saying like, oh, this group is selling software, but we of course don't. And it remains one of the most taboo topics in the oral history interviews that I have conducted up to now. I mean, these internal letters, they do not put our perception of the scene as an anti-commercial enterprise completely on its head. It's not like after we have these sources we can say, oh, the scene was totally commercial. Of course, it's not like that. But still, these letters reveal much stronger than any other source the constant presence of money exchanges in the scene. Not only in the form of, like, for example, original suppliers within cracking groups being reimbursed for their services, or sometimes even crackers being reimbursed for their services, but also, for example, transactions such as when scene musicians did music for intros of other groups for money. This was apparently in parts of the C64 scene quite a common occurrence. Or the letters, for example, also give proof to monetary exchanges between some cracker groups in Western Europe and local software sellers in Southern and Eastern Europe, which of course constitutes a very interesting part of like the transnational history of software and of home computing. So these sources are important not in order to sort of like tear off the mask of the scene or anything, but to draw a much more nuanced picture of its history and to do away with cliché representations of subversive and selfless digital activism. But okay, before my time runs out completely, back to the project I was actually about to talk here. Because while getting more and more paper materials from scene veterans, I quickly came across a practical problem. Because if I want to base my research on these materials and to make my research transparent, how do I reference all this stuff? I mean, I cannot write in every third footnote, oh, this document is in my personal possession, because of course historical research and referencing needs to be somehow transparent and like other people being able to look up this stuff themselves. So I had to put all these materials in some place where they would be accessible for both my academic peers and for the wider public. So I had to do this digitization project. One possibility would probably have been to do like a proper big academic digitization project with like assembling a team, handing in like applications for funding and so on. However, as my like first priority was to write my habilitation monograph and not to begin a completely new digitization project, so the choice was to do this as a sort of DIY project driven by community submissions and making use of my credentials as both an academic as a demo scener. Because after all, part of my motivation behind this was also to give something back to the community and provide the scene itself with sources of its history and of its often forgotten aspects. Thus, the decision to host not only materials that pertain to my own research project on the early cracking scene, but also hosting contemporary demo scene materials such as flyers, demo party tickets and such things, also in order to get the younger scene generation's attention to the project. Marco, you're already standing here. Does it mean that my time is slowly running out? Okay. And also, of course, a less altruistic motivation was for the project to function as a sort of honeypot for scene veterans who would be willing to get interviewed for my bigger project. So Got Papers was launched in April 2015, and yeah, the project has a sort of double structure. So on the one hand, it is like the file repository for the actual okay, so I need to reconnect. Yes. So on the one hand, it's a file repository for the actual scans, yeah, sorted by different types of materials such as disc covers, discs, magazines, and here are the letters sorted by the owner of the particular collection, like those who donated this stuff to me. So here you can also see the metadata. I mean, I tried to include as much metadata as is needed to be able to properly work with these sources, so that fellow historians and those who are interested can see, like, from where this artifact is, when is it scanned, what is the resolution, and so on. So I tried to make it like as transparent as possible and carrying as much information as possible to be able to work with these materials. And the front end of the project, so to say, is this website / blog where new additions to the project are presented, often with shorter or longer introductions. And this is actually where you can also search search the collection. So, for example, to see all letters originating from Australia, for example. Or also one can choose the materials by keywords. So, like, to see all posts that include party, copy party, or demo party flyers. So yeah, how does the source base grow? Where do the artifacts come from? All in all, it is kind of a snowball system. So sceners and scene veterans hear from their peers that I'm collecting these things and contact me. Or sometimes I get to know people and convince them to provide their archives. Some of them just want to get rid of their archives. For example, I had to collect the letters of a German C64 scene veteran very quickly, because he planned a house moving at a particular date and wanted to get rid of these materials, otherwise threatening to throw these valuable letters away. So actually I had to come and collect them very quickly. Others, to the contrary, are emotionally attached to these old documents and are even hesitant to lend them out for scanning and prefer to scan them themselves, which in these cases I just provide the instructions, like what is the resolution, how they should scan it. Now that Got Papers is online for over 4 years, one can make some preliminary conclusions, like what were the effects of this preservation effort up to now? What are the inherent problems also of this project and this whole approach? As for the impact of Got Papers, I mean, besides the important impact it had on my own research project, I mean, one could say on the scene side, on the demo scene side, I think it did kind of raise the awareness of the participants of the scene for the history of its own subculture, and particularly its, material and analogous nature. This manifests itself, for example, in the trend that those active demo sceners who still produce paper artifacts, such as flyers or stickers, do not just wait until I stumble upon these things at a demo party, but directly send them to me with the expectation that I would scan them, and actually then keep on reminding me to finally scan their stickers or their flyers. As for veterans of the scene, or temporarily inactive old sceners, it seemed to have raised the awareness for the fact that their own past is not only part of history as such, but also that they themselves have valuable materials for this history. For example, I already mentioned Honey of 101 Crew, a very important C64 scener, who decided to donate his materials to the Municipal Archive of Alkmaar. But before he did so, he actually contacted me a year before that and sent me 2.5 gigabytes of the scans of these materials. So apparently this is probably what motivated him to hand in these materials into a proper institutionalized archive. As for the impact on research besides my own, it's really hard to say. I mean, at least up to now, I have not seen academic papers quoting these materials or dealing with these materials, but I hope this will change, though, because there are many interesting questions that one can pose to these historical materials and hopefully also solve with the help of these materials. And of course, the project is not without flaws and pitfalls. When I started in 2015, I imagined many things differently. So to conclude, I just want to point out just some of the pitfalls that might also be relevant for similar preservation projects situated between subcultures and academia. One problem, of course, concerns the infrastructure and its impact on the co-creation or co-preservation character. Because this is basically a one-man project done by someone who is a keen digital preserver but has absolutely no clue of web coding or database coding. So basically, this whole infrastructure of this WordPress blog and a FTP server is, of course, a massive bottleneck. Because people have to send the materials to me, I have to process them, I have to research the metadata and so on. I mean, luckily I have a student intern, Anna Baumann, to whom I'm very grateful and who does a great job with scanning the materials. But as for researching the context of these documents, for example, often enough I have letters which have no date. So basically I have to go through all the cracks, all the cracked games mentioned in the letter, and then to say, okay, what is the possible earliest date of this letter? Of course, this eats a lot of time and results in the fact that I have nearly 10 gigabytes of materials in my queue right now. And while the positive feedback from the scene is overwhelming, no one really wants to get involved on a volunteer basis. And I issued several calls for help within the communication structures of the scene, but up to now very little came out of it. Of course, there are some other pitfalls, such as the shaky basis of the project concerning data protection and compliance to the relevant laws and regulations. Of course, I try to black out, or not only, I always black out information that can lead to the identification of the individuals in these letters. But so no one complained, and I hope it will stay that way. And finally, of course, the project balances between two groups of recipients. On the one hand, sceners, on the other hand, researchers. So it's always a bit of a balancing act, especially when it comes to contextualizing these materials on the website. So how to contextualize them in a wider history of digital cultures while avoiding the pitfalls of either uncritically reproducing the scene's narratives or, like the other extreme, being overly critical and thus potentially offending those who provide the materials for these projects. And this is, of course, not only a problem of this project, but a question that comes up in any kind of participant observer-like research on subcultures. So, yes, thank you for your attention, and I'll be very happy to discuss all the aspects with you.
Thank you, Gleb, for your interesting presentation, and also, of course, for unearthing all these materials for everybody else to view. Now, questions, comments?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation and for all the work you've done with the materials. It seems to be a lot. We are planning to make an exhibition about the demo scene at the Finnish Museum of Games. Would these materials be available for showing at an exhibition, or what do you think about, have you any plans for exhibitions otherwise?
No, I actually don't, but this of course would be great. I mean, there are of course several problems that would need to be solved. Like in many cases, I don't actually own the physical materials. So as I said, some sceners are so attached to their old papers that they want to keep them. While of course others are just happy to get rid of them. So of course I do have quite a lot of these letters also in physical form. But there, of course, one would have to contact the owner or like the original preservers of these materials, whether they would be fine with exhibiting these. And of course, all the like blacking out of real names and so on. This of course also would, I mean, this problem would have to be taken into account when doing anything with these materials. I mean, of course, my long-term plan is, of course, to donate these materials to some like real archive, because I mean, now that they are just stacked in boxes in my university office, this is of course not the optimal way to preserve actually the physicality of these materials. But then, of course, I would have to approach all these scene veterans again and ask them whether they are okay with me giving these materials to some institution. So, I mean, in general, yeah, of course, but many questions would need to be solved before that.
And there was a Discover exhibition just recently here at the Museum of Games. Other questions? Thank you once again, Gleb.
Thank you.